Good evening, everyone. I think everyone knows me, but for anyone who doesn't, I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind. And welcome to this MarketingKind exchange in which we'll explore the role of conscious capitalism in the age of Trump, with our special guest, the co-founder of the Conscious Capitalism movement, Raj Sisodia. Last year was, of course, the hottest year on record, the first to surpass the 1.5-degree threshold of global average temperature rise above pre-industrial levels and had over 120 unprecedented extreme weather events. And yet, the Trump presidency has cancelled and dialed back on climate commitments and withdrawn the US from international cooperation on the climate emergency. Businesses in the US and around the world who have the US government as a client are cancelling and scaling back on their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and even understating the activities they are maintaining for fear of political backlash. Important inequalities are rising as resources are diverted from some of the people most exposed to the problems that we face, not least, for example, with the virtual closure of US aid. The US has launched a stop-start trade war that, even in the words of one of Trump's own supporters, has threatened an economic nuclear winter. And Trump appears to reserve much of his antagonism for allies rather than adversaries, including with his stated intentions to annex the Panama Canal, Greenland, and even Canada. He said that he'd like to turn the Gaza Strip into the Riviera of the Middle East and seemed genuinely confused over who initiated the invasion of Ukraine. In a Financial Times article, Trump's presidency was recently described as being a bit like a giant denial of service malware attack on the whole world community. But it also needs to be seen in the context of a narrative environment which is increasingly polarizing and in which it seems increasingly easy to spread misinformation at scale. Now, conscious capitalism, on the other hand, is an approach to business that seeks to heal our wounds and solve rather than create important problems. So can it launch an insurgency at the scale of intensity of today's needs? Well, we could hardly be in better company to find out because, as well as being co-founder of the Conscious Capitalism movement, Raj is co-founder and chair emeritus of Conscious Capitalism Inc., president of Awaken Inc., is FEMSA distinguished chair and is also of professor of conscious enterprise and chair of the Conscious Enterprise Center at Tecnológico de Monterrey. The first book I read of Raj's was The Healing Organization, which, as it happens, among many others, includes a beautiful case study of Greystone Bakery, the CEO of which joined us for a previous MarketingKind gathering after their approach of open hiring was recommended to us by David Boynton, the outgoing global CEO of The Body Shop, in his exchange with us on purposeful enterprise in turbulent times. Raj has written 16 books, including New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestsellers, has consulted with many of the biggest businesses in the world, was recognized by the Chartered Institute of Marketing as one of the greatest marketing thinkers of all time, and has spoken about conscious capitalism over 1,000 times, including in the Vatican and in the White House. So we'll see if, as a result of today's conversation, the current administration renews that invitation. Welcome to MarketingKind, Raj. How are you feeling today?
I am well, thank you, Paul, and very glad to be with you and this community. And thank you for that wonderful and very thoughtful introduction. You have really framed it in a very broad and meaningful way. So looking
Well,
forward to our exchange of thoughts here.
we see you very much as a kindred spirit lighting the path ahead of us. But today, I think, is the 101st day of the Trump presidency. For anyone wondering this, that means I think there is 1,360 still to go. What's your headline take on the Trump presidency so far? How we should make sense of it or respond to it?
You know, we're all struggling with this. It was a tremendous shock the day it happened. It went against all the opinion polling that had led up to the election. It seemed inconceivable that we would return to this after having experienced it for 4 years. I literally could not sleep the entire night. And for a few days after that, I was completely discombobulated. I was in Mexico at the time, and it was just, and we had a lot of fears and apprehensions. And in this case, they were proven to be actually not quite what the reality was actually worse. Often you fear the worst and then things are kind of okay. You might say that about his first term, he was curtailed to a little degree, but this time it's been madness, I think, from the beginning, and it's a combination of chaos and cruelty and confusion, and yeah, this is not statesmanship, by any stretch of the imagination, and I think it points to what leaders are capable of eliciting in the population. You have leaders who can appeal to our better angels and elevate us. The same population, different leaders can bring out the best or the worst. You have the famous Milgram experiments where ordinary people were very easily, in a way, manipulated or enticed or incentivized to do terribly cruel things to their fellow people, right? These were the experiments at Yale by the son of a Holocaust survivor who said, what makes ordinary people do terrible things? And so that can happen. Very few people have the sort of inner strength to resist a malevolent authority, and people go along in most cases. And we're seeing that's true of CEOs, and that's true of senators, and that's true of congresspeople in this country, and many judges as well, right? There's no adherence to a higher set of principles. For most people, lack the moral courage and the moral clarity that defines, a Pope Francis, a Gandhi, a Lincoln, a Mandela, a King, many others like that. And I was, after Pope Francis passed last week, I was all literally in tears, actually. And I said, who's left? Other than the Dalai Lama, who's left on the global stage that we can universally look up to? And so, yeah, I think it's been a really dark time. These 100 days have felt like 100 months in many ways. Likened Trump before the election, actually. I wrote somewhere that he's like there's something called a black light. And if you're familiar with the black light, you shine it in a darkened room and you can see things that are otherwise invisible. It will, stains on the wall and all kinds of things show up right under that black light. And I felt like, Trump is the political version of a black light, which is making visible ugly stains in people's characters and, bringing out kind of the worst in them and, in a way, emboldening people to articulate, some of the things that they previously may have felt ashamed to do, rightly so. So the implicit becomes explicit, and the unspeakable is now proudly proclaimed by people. So I think we're living in that moment. It feels like to me. And lastly, this is a long answer to a short question. I also liken these years to Star Wars. If you remember the Star Wars original trilogy, it was, like a three-act story, right? There was The Force Awakens, which was the awakening of consciousness that has been going on the planet. I would say ever since the Berlin Wall came down, we entered a new chapter in world history in a way, where there was a movement towards more enlightened and liberal ways of being around the world in multiple dimensions. And the World Wide Web was invented that year as well in 1989. So we were living in what I call the age of transcendence. So we had entered an age of transcendence where we were starting to think beyond just that material way of being. But then inevitably there's a backlash. And I think we're in that moment right now. This is the Empire Strikes Back. This is the established order trying to reassert itself, and trying to go back to a golden past that actually never really existed. But we have to hold true and steadfast, and I think there's always an episode 3, and that is the return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
So we have to remain resolute and continue to train and stay true to our principles and not compromise. We bend, not break, but we stay connected to those higher principles.
Yeah, there's a line, I believe, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a text that I think you actually cite in Awaken, though not this particular concept, but there's the idea that the actions of the unjust can serve to awaken the just to better action. And
Yes.
so maybe there is the opportunity for that back and forth. But I'd like to dive into a couple of the things you've already said, which just felt like such a beautiful prelude to things we could talk more about. But one of your comments in terms of the actions of a leader can make some things more possible and some things less possible and can shift behaviors. And in, I think it was the Healing Organization, but in your writing, I've come across your observation that we often think about individual bad apples. But you can also take the social psychology perspective and say, well, we don't need to think about individual bad apples as much as bad barrels. And then you can more fundamentally take a systems approach and think, well, actually, what we need is better barrel makers in the first place. What does that
Mhm.
sort of tripartite analysis, can that yield any light into what's going on with the Trump presidency and the context in which we're operating?
Yes, I think so. I think it's the power of ideas. And I think it's Sam Harris who said bad ideas are more powerful than bad people.
Mm,
Right? A few bad people, don't really change anything. But bad ideas, once they catch hold, they can really wreak havoc. You look at, communism and the countries that adopted that and how much pain and suffering came from that. I mean, those were bad ideas that were not in harmony with human nature. Um, and so I think we are seeing that. And we are seeing, again, people don't have that ability to distinguish and they just swallow. And, when you have demagogues and others who are very skilled at
mm,
using rhetoric, as Trump and undeniably is, you can exploit the pain and suffering that is real out there in the world to get power and then use that power to essentially destroy the institutions. And we've seen that play out multiple times in the last century and even to some degree in this century as well. And so I think that very much remains true, and therefore the power of leadership and who we elect and who we select as leaders in organizations matters so very much. I'm heading to New York tomorrow with the Conscious Capitalism New York chapter, and we're having an evening event there, and the theme is leading with love.
mm,
What does that mean, and why do we need it more than ever right now? Right? And the imperative to do that in an age when the leadership is really predicated on
mm,
just naked accumulation of power and greed and fueling an ego and
mm.
a hole in the psyche that cannot be filled by anything.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're dealing with right now. But the opposite of that is leading with love. That's what we need. That's what Pope Francis stood for. That's what the Dalai Lama stands for, and many others in the past.
Yeah. You mentioned communism as an obviously bad idea, and capitalism is another idea. In the Healing Organization, you wrote, business can help save the world and restore the American dream. And that felt pretty uncontroversial to me when I read it when it came out. Um, Is that something, do you still have full belief in that proposition, even in today's environment?
Absolutely, done in the right way. See, again, going back to ideas. So economics and therefore business are predicated on a set of assumptions, right? The theoretical foundations of economics.
Mm,
And I know you've had some guests on that I'm sure have spoken to that. But the whole caricature of human beings as Homo economicus, right? That we are purely economic beings, economic rational value maximizers. We look at everything through that lens. It's typically short term, it's individualistic, it's materialistic,
mm,
right? And when you start with that assumption and you build all your theories and frameworks and policies and methods and all of that around that, the strange thing about some theories and in the world of in social sciences, particularly, this is very true. Theories become self-fulfilling.
mm,
If they catch on with a critical mass, then you start behaving according to what the theory says. that you're supposed to behave, even though your instinct might be telling you something else. Okay. And there's a lot of research on this, that economic students, for example, in certain experimental studies, continuously and routinely behave in a more selfish and self-serving way than students who might be coming from other educational, training, because they've been taught that this is what a human being is. Right? It narrows us down. As Muhammad Yunus said, we act like money is the only game in town. There are many games in town, and this is not, probably not even the most important one. Yeah, this is the economic side of our life, and that's important. But is that why we're here? We are here in this human embodiment and the miraculous creative capacities that we have, which are almost divine, to do something a lot more than just accumulate this intangible thing called money, right? But I think that is what has happened here. So there's a classic article by Sumantra Ghoshal called Why Bad Management Theories Are Destroying Good Management.
Mm.
And I think this is what has happened in business school. If you've been to business school, there's some theories that you're taught which are almost treated as gospel. It's agency theory by Jensen Meckling, that basically managers have to be bribed to do the right thing, align their interests with that of the shareholders, so give them lots of stock options. And that's defining right thing as doing what's right for the shareholder. Even that's a challenge. That's a problem. If you only focus on shareholders, it's creating a lot of suffering for other stakeholders in the business. There's Michael Porter's 5 forces of competition, which again we learned early on, and that's like everybody is a competitive threat. Your customers can backward integrate, your suppliers can forward integrate, your fellow industry players are bitter enemies to be vanquished, and so forth. Everybody starts to look like a threat, and then we start behaving that way. We concoct our strategies accordingly, and it becomes true. So again, there's a lot of research on that. So we have to be very careful. I'm actually working with an evolutionary biologist now named David Sloan Wilson, who is one of the preeminent people in that field, applying Darwin, in a much broader way. It's not just about biological evolution; it's also cultural evolution that happens and can happen very rapidly, actually, through a similar process of replication, selection, inheritance, and so forth. And we can actually evolve in a positive way. So we need a more a human-based theoretical foundation. We are Homo economicus. We are Homo sapiens. We are not Homo economicus, right? Yes, we have self-interest, but that doesn't mean we are selfish all the time. We also are altruistic. We are incredibly cooperative. We are purpose-driven, and we are rooted in love.
Yeah.
And if we tap into those qualities and those aspects of our being in our theories, economics and business, that would result in a very different set of actions and policies and ways of leading than the pure Homo economicus idea, which is everybody's in this game for themselves. Everybody's looking to maximize their piece of the puzzle. Everybody becomes a taker from the system, and therefore no system can thrive if every part of that system is just looking to extract from it. No
Yeah.
company can thrive if the employee wants the highest pay, customer wants the lowest price, supplier wants the highest margin, society wants the highest taxes, CEO wants the highest profits. It's got to give somewhere, right? But if everybody believes in the purpose and believes in the values, everybody's a contributor to the flourishing of the whole. And
Yeah.
that's why, in our experience and research, conscious companies perform so well over time, even in financial terms, in addition to all the other kinds of wealth and well-being that they generate, is because everybody is aligned.
Yeah.
You're not working at cross purposes. You're sharing. You're attracted as if with a magnet. You're attracted to this business as a customer, as an employee, etc. So I think the theories matter a great deal, and we need to start from that foundation level. What does it mean to be human?
I think that's right. And I mean, in a sense, a lot of economic thinking reduces humans and portrays us through a lens that is less than what we are. People aren't just consumers passively receiving value, they're actively improving their own and each other's lives. Employees aren't just
Yeah.
resources doing what they're told, they can bring their
Mhm.
discretionary efforts and talent to bear, and so on. And I'd love to dig into that a lot more. I think just while we're relatively early in the conversation, I think our group is very pro purposeful enterprise, very supportive of stakeholder approaches to capitalism. So we likely have an intuitive sense of what conscious capitalism is. But maybe you could give us your sense of how you define conscious capitalism, and is there a particular evolution of conscious capitalism that is particularly necessary at this point in time?
Yeah, so conscious capitalism as a philosophy was articulated in 2008. Uh, I came to it through my research for the book Firms of Endearment, which came out in 2007, which came from my frustration with marketing. I'm a marketing PhD from Columbia University, and I taught marketing for 20 plus years. And I was frustrated because I felt we were spending so much money in this country, in the US. In 2004, we spent $1 trillion on ads, coupons, and junk mail. Okay, now that was more than the GDP of India that year. Now, a billion people in India were living on $700 billion, and we in the US were spending $1 trillion on ads, coupons, and junk mail for 300 million people. And so my question was, what are we getting for that? Are customers better off? Are companies better off? And is society better off with that money being spent? And all my research led me to conclude the answer is no, that 88% of customers do not trust marketing. If it's marketing, that means it's not real, it's not true, right? Everybody, that joke exists in all cultures, right? That's not real, that's just marketing, right? Now imagine this, my father got a PhD in agriculture science, okay? And so my inner dialogue, my father got a PhD in plant science because his dream was to cure world hunger. And I got a PhD in marketing, and I'm just out here selling more junk, right, to people who don't really need it, and it's not going to make their life better. So I had this very, almost a sense of shame about it because of the way in which it was being practiced, by and large. In fact, Peter Drucker referred to the consumer movement as the shame of marketing. That marketing job is to look after the well-being of customers. They have to organize against companies. And I almost wrote a book with that title, The Shame of Marketing, but it was really my own shame. I didn't have meaning and purpose in my life. And I didn't think I was doing anything noble. And I was an idealistic, I am an idealistic person. I wanted, have a positive impact in the world. So, but that frustration, there's always a silver lining, or there's something positive out of any of those things. So it led me to ask a question: is there a better way to think about all this? And that's a very important question in any arena. I think there's always a better way. The answer is always yes. And so I was searching for, I said, I've documented the fact that companies are spending enormous amounts of money and getting lousy returns, and customer loyalty and trust are going down even as spending is going up at the economy level. And so what's the opposite of that? Which are the companies that don't spend a lot of money on marketing and yet their customers love them, right? And with that simple lens, I started finding companies, and I soon discovered it was a broader story than that. Not only did the customers love these companies, but so did the employees. They loved working there. They were highly engaged and passionate and creative. And so these companies suppliers were loyal to them, communities welcomed and embraced them. So they were really operating from a stakeholder mindset. They were caring about the well-being of all of their stakeholders. And then I said, what makes that happen? So we found the four pillars of conscious capitalism, which is a higher purpose beyond profit. Profit is essential, but that's not why you exist. That's not why we exist or the company exists. Right? It's like saying I need to breathe, I need oxygen, but the purpose of my life is not to accumulate massive amounts of oxygen and store them somewhere. Right? It's to use the oxygen to live my life and do what my life is meant to be about. Right? So profit is essential, but it's not the purpose. There needs to be a higher purpose. You're doing something worth that is. I think Colin Meyer says that we are trying to find profitable solutions, right, to the problems of people and the planet. And then we found that they had this explicit stakeholder orientation. They're looking not to use stakeholders to make money, but actually to serve them and create value for each of them and with them for the whole enterprise. And then a culture that actually people love going to work. So the core values, we share certain values. And then conscious leaders who are in service to the people and to that purpose. And so those are the four pillars of conscious capitalism. And we have found that when companies do that well, do all of these, each of them by itself has an impact. It elevates the company's performance. If you just, adopt a higher, find and live a higher purpose and don't change anything else, that will make a difference. So if you just change your culture towards one that is trusting and caring and authentic. And likewise, if you do any one of them, it'll make a difference. But if you do all of them, they are synergistic and mutually reinforcing. And it creates a very, very high performing business. My research in firms of endearment found that that set of companies that we identified as fitting this profile outperformed the overall market by a 9-to-1 ratio over 10 years.
Mm.
Even while paying their people better, frontline people like Costco was paying double of Walmart and paying their suppliers well and investing in their communities and investing in the environment and paying taxes at a higher rate. And they're still making more money for their investors. Why? Because they've got the value creation engine working on all cylinders. And they're not wasting money on marketing, ads and coupons, and junk mail. Their employee turnover is almost zero. They don't know. Walmart was hiring 2 million people every year to replace those who left voluntarily. Costco, which is a beloved retailer here in the US, people join and never leave,
Mm.
right? So you don't have that expense. So even though you pay your people double, your sales per employee are 3 times higher, and you're saving enormously on employee training and recruiting costs. So anyway, there's a whole set of factors that go into that. So those are the four pillars of conscious capitalism: higher purpose, stakeholder orientation, conscious leadership, and a caring culture. The evolution of it now, I think, it is in two ways. One is towards the healing organization. That's why I wrote that book. That you can either operate your business in this way, and or you can be out there actively seeking ways to reduce suffering in our world and bring more joy into our world. And that's what these healing organizations are doing. Okay. So I think in a way it's super conscious companies that are actively searching and looking for ways to reduce suffering within their organizations and in their communities, with their customers, and in the world at large. The other direction now is we are increasingly thinking about a conscious strategy.
Mm.
How do we create a strategy for the business that is rooted in consciousness, where competitive advantage derives from your adherence to these conscious principles? It's not coming from creating quasi monopolies or erecting barriers to entry or all the stuff that Porter would prescribe, right? How do you reduce competitive intensity and therefore earn disproportionate returns? But it's actually coming from doubling down on your purpose and on love. And this word love, by the way, shows up in all four pillars. Okay, your purpose is a loving purpose. Your stakeholders, you're treating them with love and respect. Leaders are operating with strength and love at the same time, right? Not one or the other. Strength without love is tyranny, but love without strength is ineffective. You need both. And the culture is also rooted in trust and caring. And so that is, I think, the sort of I would say the secret ingredient or not so secret ingredient of conscious businesses. Traditional businesses only operate on self-interest. Everybody's out there in their own self-interest, choosing to come together around this enterprise.
Mm.
Conscious companies also are built on love and care.
Mm.
You love, the business in terms of what you're trying to achieve in the world, and you care about the people you work with, and you care about the people you serve. So
Mm.
business becomes a way to scale caring into the world. We're here in a free society. Governments don't take care of our needs. They create the conditions where companies can meet our needs. And if you do that in a loving, caring way, that heals us. But if you do that in an exploitative way, that harms us. You could be
Mm.
selling the same product. You could be a food company right out there. But if you just look at people as targets and objects and try to get them hooked and addicted to your stuff, right, so that you can make money, as opposed to you see them as people who need nurturing and, we can improve their health and well-being, through the right foods, that becomes healing versus hurting. So if you think about business as a way of expressing yourself and serving others, as
Mm.
opposed to a way of using others to serve yourself, it makes an enormous difference.
There is so much there that I'd like to pick up on, thinking about how to respond to Trump, how we rehabilitate marketing. But I'll start with the love and healing dimension that you talked about, because to heal, you kind of need a safe space to heal. If you have a wound, you bandage it so that it's protected during that healing process. Um, but there are so many dimensions to today's narrative environment that are toxic. One way of looking at it is that, the Industrial Revolution created prosperity but had the shadow of carbon emissions. that have led to the climate emergency. The digital revolution has connected us. It's made today possible. It would have been much more difficult to fly you over for the conversation. But at the same time, the algorithms of social media polarize rather than bring us together. The capacity, the opportunities for misinformation and for whipping up hatred are so great that we almost face a digital emergency or an emergency of our narrative environment in which good sense doesn't seem to prevail. So how do we heal in a narrative environment that seems ill-conducive to healing?
Well, like with everything else, it begins with the consciousness of the leaders.
Mm,
Okay, it's the consciousness of the leader that determines the consciousness of the organization. And if you have a conscious leader in any of those industries, any of those sectors, they're operating with higher consciousness in the context of their work, then they will, in fact, break those trade-offs and they will, in fact, change those algorithms, etc., to actually be pro-social and benefit people rather than using people. So social media, for example, I'm actually on the advisory board of a company called MeWe, which is trying to be Facebook without all the downsides of it, right? The algorithms that are trying to exploit your attention and the lack of privacy and so forth. So
mm,
again, it's the consciousness of the leaders that determines the overall impact. Every technology is a double-edged sword. We've always known
mm,
that. A surgeon can use a scalpel to save a life, and somebody else can use it to end a life. AI is one of the most important or powerful tools ever invented by human beings. And the consciousness of the people who deploy it, therefore, matters tremendously now
mm,
because it can be used to double down on exploitation and on, race to the bottom and cutting costs and cutting people and preying on their fears and vulnerabilities and so forth. We can do that very efficiently. But we can also figure out how to enact purpose in a deeper level, how to get ever closer to the essence of our stakeholders and what they really not only want, but also what they truly need. They may not even be aware of. So again, every tool can be used. So therefore, the consciousness is the sort of common element across that. How do we elevate consciousness? How do we get people to see? And in a way, our entire journey on this planet is one of gradually awakening consciousness,
mm,
right? We are slowly waking up. There's things we did 200 years ago. Slavery was all over the world, right? Every civilization had it until 160 years ago. But now we've moved past that. 100 years ago, women could not vote anywhere except New Zealand and one other island, I think. And the US was 1920, I think. I can't imagine that. 76 years ago, India was still a British colony. We had colonialism, another form of slavery.
mm,
50 years ago, we still had segregation between blacks and whites in parts of the US. 30 or so years ago, we still had apartheid in South Africa. Right? 20 years ago, gay people had very few rights and couldn't get married in most countries. So we are on that journey of slowly waking up and recognizing a larger reality, our
mm,
interconnectedness, a finer sense of right and wrong,
mm,
right? Taking responsibility for the consequences of our actions. That's what it means to be
mm,
conscious, right? And once we do that, then we start leading and behaving differently, and our businesses start to have a different impact. You look at Microsoft, Satya Nadella was appointed 10 years ago as CEO, and look at the dramatic change that has come about in that company compared to what it was under Gates and then under Balmer. The power of a leader is extraordinary, actually, if you think about it. So,
Interesting that, in a sense, your whole work on conscious capitalism had some of its origins in a um, a disappointment with the state of marketing and thinking that there needed to be a better way. But I wonder how we rehabilitate marketing in this context. You talked about needs that people have that maybe they don't even know they have yet. To what degree does the shift in marketing need to be moving away from a sort of economy of persuasion, funding big technology to target people and to persuade them to buy what we have for our short-term interests, towards a model where marketing is about better understanding what human flourishing means for all of our
Yes.
stakeholders, and then finds the right narrative to bring that to life in a way that a business can fulfill. How much of that is the opportunity for marketing, and how do we make that happen?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's not about marketing being good or bad. It's about unconscious marketing or lower consciousness marketing versus higher consciousness marketing, right? Conscious marketing. If marketing purely focuses on our need to separate the customer from their money and figure out how to do that on a sustained basis, that becomes harmful. But if we truly and deeply understand not their desires and wants and addictions, but their real underlying needs, right? We have a lot of real needs, right? How can we satisfy those and elevate the quality of life for our customers, including things that they may not even realize? They don't know what's possible until we, in a way, lead them. So it's not about following the customer and just responding to every whim and every, the way we've set it up is like, within seconds, whatever desire you have can be fulfilled, right? It can be delivered to your home within 30 minutes. Uh, John Updike, one of my favorite authors, once said, America is a vast conspiracy to make you happy. Okay. And not truly happy. It's just to fulfill your every, desire, right? Whatever you want now, even much more than when he wrote those words. That is true today. But if we talk about marketing from a consciousness perspective, that what is the higher purpose of marketing? It is not to maximize market share and maximize revenue and maximize all of that stuff. It is to meet real customer needs at a deeper and deeper level and improve the quality of life of customers. And then if you do that, it becomes a noble. See, every profession can be a noble profession, right? Law, I mean, we make jokes about lawyers and how unscrupulous most of them are. And so well, it's at the root of it, there's a noble thing. It's about justice, right? It's about fairness, but it has become, exploiting the law to gain, often unfair advantage, right? And in a way, skirt justice and fair play. So again, we have to connect to what is the higher purpose of
Mhm.
marketing, right? Which is in this case, it's about business, customers, and how can we truly earn not just their behavioral loyalty, but their emotional, psychological loyalty, where they feel they love this brand, they love this company for the right reasons, not because my friends are wearing it and I feel cool, and otherwise I would feel, I don't fit in or whatever. There's a lot of that, right? We use women's bodies to sell products in marketing. And have done so for a century now. Now, what has that done to the culture? What has that done to the psyches of young women? There's a lot of research on that. A friend of mine has produced a series of documentaries called Killing Us Softly, where she has documented the impact of advertising and the depiction of women and use of women's bodies in advertising, and the impact that that has on eating disorders and body dysmorphia and depression among teenage girls. And that continues, right, for their lifetime. So again, there's a lot of um, sort of collateral damage. That $1 trillion, I mean, that's a lot of artillery, that we are putting into it's now 1.3 trillion actually in the US. It's causing having a huge impact on the culture. It may not be good for customers or society or even the companies, but it's certainly shaping our culture in a negative way for the most part. I don't know if you all have seen Adolescence, the series on Netflix right now, which is it's kind of a brutal wake-up call, I think, and saying we have failed our young people. We have created these technologies, and then we have allowed them to be used in ways that is just, it's like an uncontrolled experiment on the psyches of, multiple young generations now. And look at what it's doing, to young boys and young girls. And, we think they're safe in their room because they're not out on the street, but they are not safe. And so I think consciousness being brought to marketing is vital. Um, and also, therefore, we need to change the theoretical foundations of it as well. And those of you who went to business school will remember the 4 Ps of marketing, right? Price, product, place, promotion. We're supposed to figure out the right answers on those 4 things. I wrote a book some years ago with my mentor Jack Sheth called The 4 As of Marketing: Creating Value for Customers, Companies, and Society. It was really it came out of all of this frustration. We did a book before that called Does Marketing Need Reform? And we invited all the leading scholars of marketing, from Philip Kotler and everybody who was around to contribute to that book. And everybody said, yeah, we do need reform. Every other function is doing more with less, and we're doing less with more. We're getting more money spent, and we're getting worse outcomes in terms of customer loyalty and trust, and especially customer quality of life and well-being. So the 4 A's of marketing really turned it around, and they say we have to create value, right, for the customer as a starting point. So the A's are acceptability. Our offering has to meet and exceed the needs and expectations of our customers, functionally and psychologically. It has to be highly, highly acceptable to them, right? It has to solve their problems. Affordability. They have to have the ability to pay and the willingness to pay. We have to be creating much more value than what we're charging. Right? So that's the profit that the customer makes. There's accessibility. That includes availability and convenience, that people are able to access this product and get it when they need it. And then there's awareness. People
Mm.
have to know about it and know what it's capable, what it can do for them, right? So there's brand awareness and product knowledge, etc. So that's a framework that actually then aligns everything that we do with value creation. Everything that we're doing is increasing one or more of the 4 A's. That's our job in marketing. And ideally to have them all at a high level for our customers, right? And when you do that, you actually end up spending a lot less and creating a lot more value for customers.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to dive into that a little more actually, because it's so relevant to our community. But I want to make sure that I get your advice on one thing, which is it's interesting that you talk about love and healing, and that doesn't shock me. But for context, for anyone who may not be aware in the group, your movement and your advisory work, you've reached, some of the most corporate entities on the planet. And if we think back to the response to Trump, you said not many people are standing up to and challenging Trump's narrative. Um, Politically, where people have stood up to Trump, it's actually done them rather well. I mean, in a sense, Mark Carney won his election yesterday because of President Trump. And yet in business, it feels as if corporate leaders were somewhat welcoming of the Trump presidency, hoping it would lead to lower taxes, and that they have not been particularly standing up to Trump's narratives until quite recently when it comes to the earnings calls. And then they say, well, actually, our earnings forecasts for the coming quarters are reduced because of particular policies, and that's their version of the backlash. Somehow you've managed to reach very corporate leaders with an enlightened perspective of love, healing, a different approach to business. What advice would you give them in terms of how to respond to today's environment? Should they be challenging the core narratives? Is there still a business case for conscious enterprise? Should they overcome their fear? What advice would you give a corporate leader who so far has only criticized Trump if it affects their earnings calls?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's such a narrow and selfish perspective, that it's what's in it for me. And business leaders have often come together in associations and chambers of commerce and so forth to affect policy purely with that lens, what's good for business, right? Not necessarily what is good for our world, what's good for, it can't just be, see, what we do, and this is where the evolutionary biology perspective comes in, right? What Homo economicus tells us is that if each of us just maximizes our own, self-interest, that somehow the invisible hand of the market will make sure that everything is fine. All we need to do is become even more selfish. Okay, if it's not working, then you got to become even more self-oriented and more profit-driven and so forth. That doesn't work. Okay, you have to think at a systems level. So what is good for the individual needs to be good for the group, and needs to be good for the company, and needs to be good for the country, and needs to be good for the planet. You have to. It's called multi-level selection. You have to actually make sure that all of those are happening, right? So likewise, you don't look at initiatives only through the lens of is there a business case, which only means economic value added or profit, impact. Is there a societal case? Is there a planetary case? And is there a human case as well? All four have to be satisfied. It has to be good for society. We could end up with revolutions, right? There are many countries that have had capitalism and have now had, Venezuela being the more recent one, but 38 times. They had a free market, somewhat democratic system, and then went towards some version of communism or totalitarianism. So we have to make sure, right, that we are paying attention to those things. At a societal level, there's massive unrest. Income inequality is extremely high worldwide. Concentration of wealth is so, extreme in many, many countries. People are really suffering out there. So we'll have societal upheaval. What the impact on the planet, I think, is self-explanatory, and then the impact on people's well-being. The data are quite shocking. Heart attacks are 20% higher on Mondays in the US and in the UK, 33% higher in Sweden. Okay, our work is literally killing us. 120,000 Americans die from stress connected to work every year. 600,000 Chinese die from too much work every year. Our work is literally killing us. So there's the impact on people and what's happening to their children. The children of our employees should be considered stakeholders in our business because their futures are definitely impacted by us. So again, we have to have all of that perspective, right? And leaders have to be willing to stand up and say, what do I stand for? Now, it doesn't mean coming up with a whole new set of things. It means you already have those things. And when times get tough, you reiterate. I think one of the companies that has stood up is Costco. Right? Costco, you may not be familiar in the UK. I don't think they're operating there, but it's a beloved retailer here in the US and always known for their stakeholder orientation. They're paying their employees well, treating them very well. They're great citizens, community members, etc. And yeah, they have an approach to to diversity, and they value it. And they did not back down. They said, no, we're going to do what we believe is right. And that CEO, Jim Sinegal, the founder, he's no longer the CEO, but he's always had that courage, the
mm,
courage of his convictions. See, before Trump, you had all the, Wall Street would put pressure on public companies all the time. So they would say, why do you pay your people double what Walmart pays? You are stealing from the shareholders. We know you can hire people for less. Okay. And he said, well, I believe that people should be able to look after their families and have a decent life.
mm,
And if you don't believe that, please do not buy my stock. Okay. And he said, yeah, by the way, we pay our people double, but our sales per employee are 3 times higher. And by the way, our annual turnover is 7% and Walmart is 70%.
mm,
Okay. So our labor costs are actually less, and we have much better customer care and so on. So again, there's the courage of your convictions and knowing what is the right thing versus what is the expedient thing or what is the self-serving thing to
mm,
do. Caring for your people is the right thing to do. And by the way, it also has business benefits. There's a wonderful book called The Good Job Strategy, written by my friend and MIT professor here, Zeynep Ton. It basically looked at 4 companies and said these companies pay their people extremely well, frontline people, provide them good benefits, predictable hours, and a pathway towards growth within the company. And they're all highly competitive and much more successful than their competitors in their industry. Their prices are lower and their customer satisfaction is higher. So there's a way to be in business where all of these things are possible at the same time. So I think for leaders, again, it's not freshly articulating things, but actually already knowing what is your purpose and what are your core values and staying true to them, even when the political winds might shift. And just from a purely pragmatic sense, when this too will pass. I have to believe that this chapter will end at some point, what we are in right now. I believe this is an aberration. I don't believe, I think Martin Luther King said, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, right? I believe that the overall trajectory that we are is towards awakening, towards consciousness, towards more love, towards more cooperation, more global thinking. But progress does not happen in a straight line. You go and then there's a kind of a backlash, right? You kind of go and then you go back and then you again start a new growth. I think it always happens in fits and starts. When there's a lot of change that accumulates, inevitably the backlash begins, but then you consolidate and then you start again. I think so that will happen, and then people will remember
mm,
what did you do in those times? Who stood up and who did not.
yeah,
I think that will be revealed. So for all those reasons, I think it is a time for moral courage.
yeah,
These times call for it. You're all sitting in Europe, okay? You don't have to look far back in history to see when moral courage was demonstrated and what happened when it was not. Right? When Chamberlain went to Hitler and said, "We have peace in our times," okay, that was appeasement. But when Churchill and others stood up, I mean, that was necessary, right? So I think that's what we're starting to see, a few green shoots of that happening now, but not nearly enough.
When fairly early after the invasion, President Zelensky used a line that I've never forgotten in one of his early speeches. He said, Ukraine didn't seek greatness, but Ukraine has become great.
Hmm.
And I do think that there may be things happening in the world that we don't want to see, but that can be an opportunity to do something meaningful in response.
Yes. Now, I think trying times, they give rise to monumental leaders as well. You had a Churchill, you had a Gandhi, you had all the lots of states, you had a Roosevelt, in that time in the world, almost in reaction to a Hitler and a Mussolini and a Stalin. I mean, you had, I think so. I'm hopeful that these times will also bring up. Like I know, I think Carney in Canada is somebody nobody heard of, and now suddenly he's become a major player worldwide. Right? He is the kind of leader that stands in stark contrast.
Mm.
He's almost a polar opposite of what Trump is. And I think we're going to see probably more of that. When times are good and prosperous, you don't see a lot of, you know, leaders who are, able to bring about massive change because you don't need it as much.
Mm.
But I think we could see that emerge in the next few years.
Yeah. How do we foster this kind of courage, specifically among marketing leaders? It strikes me that if we are going to take a purposeful approach to enterprise, then that means having a story that is bigger than the numbers. And that's essentially what you've been talking about, is having something you believe in of which the numbers are a part, rather than having the numbers of which your beliefs become a smaller part. And
Mhm.
so theoretically, that should be a huge opportunity for marketing. And logically, if a business has poor numbers, but all of its stakeholders really believe in its future, then it might have one. If a business has strong numbers so far, but has just lost the trust of all of its stakeholders, it probably doesn't have a future. And yet, marketing seems to be stuck in a sort of Stockholm syndrome, where we are serving the short-term needs of a financialized business world and extracting from consumers rather than creating value that enables all stakeholders to flourish. In practical terms, how do you foster a stronger marketing function? It sounds like it may need to spend less on promotion and maybe more on better understanding all stakeholders, not just customers. But do you have particular advice for how marketing? I know much earlier in your career you wrote about how marketing could be reorganized to better represent the outside world to the business and not just the
Mhm.
business to the outside world.
Mhm.
Are there
Mhm.
practical things we can do so that marketing becomes a real champion of better narratives,
Yeah.
better values, and stronger purpose?
I think it almost calls for a complete rethink and a clean sheet redesign. You might even think of changing the name, you know, just like the human resources department should be called the people department. Human beings are not a resource, right? A resource is something you use it, it burns out. Human beings are the source of everything, right? All value, everything you look around, existed in a human mind before it came into the real world, right? Other than nature. Human beings are the source, and therefore they have to be treated as that. So a people department. I think a customer care department rather than marketing, probably. It's semantics or terminology, but that matters. Language does matter. It sends a signal, right? Um, and then I think, as you said, what does it mean to treat a customer as a consumer versus as a stakeholder? Right? We use the language of consumer in marketing, consumer behavior, we say, right? Economists refer to us as consumers. We're not citizens. Before we are citizens, we are consumers, right? What's the consumer's job is to consume, and our job is to make them consume as much as possible, right? Whether it's good for them or not, whether they need it or not, whether they can afford it or not. So it has to start with rethinking a customer as a stakeholder. What does it mean to be a stakeholder in the business? That means you're not just there for that product and that transaction. You believe in this business and what it's trying to do. Your connection and emotional bonds with that business are strong beyond the product that you get from them or the service that you get from them. This was illustrated when Whole Foods, which is a natural and organic grocery retailer, I think you have them in London as well,
Mm,
right? And they're part of the founding of Conscious Capitalism. John Mackey and I started that.
mm,
That company would have died at the age of 2 when there was a massive flood in Austin, Texas. And they only had one store, which was incredibly successful. People loved that store.
mm,
John says, somebody asked him how long did it take for Whole Foods to become profitable. He said about 2 p.m. on the opening day. Literally, people flooded it and never left. And customers loved it, employees loved it. There was an ethos there, there was a mindset. They were trying to improve people's health and well-being, educate people about what you put into your body makes a difference to your health and the health of the food system and the health of the planet. All that was in place from day one. And then the company had this flood and the entire thing was destroyed. There was 8 feet of water. I mean, all their inventory was in the store. It's all gone. All their equipment is destroyed. Refrigeration and cash registers and all of that. And uh, there was no warehouse, and they were $400,000 in debt. They still owed money to their suppliers for a lot of that stuff. Right? So they were essentially bankrupt that morning.
yeah,
And the employees were standing around looking at the devastation, and the founders were there, and some of the employees were crying, thinking it was the end of the best job they ever had. And the founders were thinking, there's no way back from this. We
mm,
maxed out our credit line at the bank. We owe money to all these suppliers. We don't know how to rebuild or even clean up this place. And the next thing they see, some of their customers start showing up at the store, not expecting to shop. I mean, they knew what had happened. It's all over the news. 10 people died in Austin from that flood. But they were carrying buckets and mops and towels and rags. And I said, come on, guys, let's clean it up. Okay, we love Whole Foods. And some neighbors, people who lived in the neighborhood, they came. And the employees then started to get some energy and they said, okay, let's try to clean it up. And they worked for weeks without pay. And John said, we don't have money to pay you. But I said, we just want to see if we can get back into business. People started holding bake sales. In the US to raise money, sometimes people bake brownies and cookies and sell them and use that money, for this is not the Red Cross, okay? This is a for-profit business. And yet people are having music concerts to raise money for Whole Foods.
mm,
And suppliers came around and they said, wow, this is pretty special what's going on here. We've never seen anything like this. So if you do reopen, we will restock you again on credit.
mm,
We
mm,
will write off some of what you owe us, most of what you owe us. The bankers came around and they said, wow, this is pretty unusual. So we will double your credit line, even though you're not credit worthy by any normal measure, right? And the friends and family who were the original investors, they also came and re-put money. So this company came back to life within 28 days, or less than, yeah, about 3 weeks. And it would not have survived were it not for the love that
mm,
their stakeholders demonstrated for them. Their stakeholders literally brought them back to life, brought them back from the dead. Okay. And it created in them a deep sense of obligation almost to say, we will never let our stakeholders down. We will always do what is right for our employees, our customers, our community members, and so forth. So that's the power when you treat your employees as stakeholders, customers as stakeholders, suppliers as stakeholders, etc. They all now are invested mentally and emotionally and sometimes financially as well in the business and the success of the business. And there's great power in that. And then you get the benefit of free marketing, word of mouth from happy, delighted customers. Not only do they keep coming back, but they bring others and employees, and everybody becomes a marketer on your behalf,
yeah,
right? Which is far more impactful than putting ads and coupons and trying to lure you back into the store with the
mm,
promise of a discount. That's not real loyalty. That's behavioral loyalty. That's not emotional loyalty. What we want is emotional loyalty and connection, right? So I think rethinking customers as stakeholders. So they're not, think of them as your guests, as your friends,
mm,
or I mean, there's a person who has written a book about something about The customer, think of the customer like they're your mother. What if that person is your mother? How would you treat them? What would you say to them?
Mhm.
Right? What would you do for them?
Mhm.
Right? And everybody should be treated that way. As Bob Chapman, one of my co-authors on a book called Everybody Matters, he had the realization one day at a wedding in Aspen. He said, everybody is somebody's precious child. Okay, thinking about the people who were getting married that day and how.
Mhm.
And he said, everybody who works at our company is somebody's precious child. Why do they not deserve the same care and respect and attention that my children do or your children do?
Mhm.
So it's about seeing people as, as whole, as deserving of dignity and love and respect. And those are your customers and treat them that way. So it's not that complicated. And then figure out how best to do that. We have enormous technologies. Marketers have at their disposal ways of getting into the psyches of customers beyond what customers even know. Like years ago, I was approached by a company in Atlanta that was doing functional MRI research, or not research, but they were using functional MRIs and wiring up customers' brains to see how they responded to certain sounds and certain words and certain colors, to see how we can hit those buttons, right? To get them almost in a Pavlovian way to behave in a certain way. And I said, no, I don't want to be part of that. That's exploiting people and using somehow this technology to go deep into below their level of consciousness, right? To almost trigger them to behave in a certain way. We should be using the technologies to serve them and understand them at a deep level, right? So some of the recommendation engines have that potential. I can recommend a book or a movie that you may never find in your normal life, but it's going to surprise and delight you, right? And same can be true of food and clothing and so forth. So again, if used the right way, all these technologies can really enhance our quality of life
Mhm.
as opposed to just get us to buy more crap that we don't really need.
First of all, thank you, Raj. A brilliant talk, insightful, intelligent, and I would say hopeful. I would give for all of us. I want to go back to just two things, if I may, with your kind permission. I'd like to. You were talking about Trump in the very beginning, being a very different type of a leader, and we're going through very bad times with him. But, if we look at history, we've had bad leaders before. We've had Maduro, Orban, Bolsonaro. We have, in fact, the list is endless, and that's the democratically elected ones. Okay, I could go on and on and on. Um, does history? So my first part of my question is: does history not repeat itself and we get over it? As you said, even to quote yourself, you said this too will pass. So, is it so dramatic?
Well, I'm not a historian and I'm not a political scientist, right?
Fair
And
enough.
but I have heard historians and others say history does not repeat itself. Sometimes it does rhyme,
Oh,
but
lovely. Yeah.
we are moving, in one direction. We're not just looping. And so hopefully we're learning lessons and not having to repeat the same lessons. We should be learning from history. We are the one species on this planet that can learn from somebody else's experience,
True.
right? And of course, books and all of that allows us to learn from people who lived a long time ago. And so if we're not learning from that and we're making the same mistakes again, well, that's something that's we need to think about. Secondly, um, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So we are learning from experience. Yeah, the impact of bad leadership. So better leaders equals a better world, right? Better leaders make for a better world. I mean, there's no question about that. Bad leaders can destroy decades or even centuries worth of progress, right? And so, how do we select and how do we elect leaders? And how do we create systems in which power and virtue go together,
Mm,
right? And this is one of the greatest needs of the world. And the problem that we have, the people who are power hungry typically are the least virtuous
mm,
because they want power over people and they want power, from an ego place, right? And they're Machiavellian and they are even in many cases sociopathic, or psychopathic. They will do anything. They have no empathy. I mean, Trump, I think, completely lacks empathy. Right? He's probably diagnosable as a narcissistic sociopath, right? And therefore cannot feel anybody else's pain, and is completely consumed with power. And there's probably childhood wounds, and there's all kinds of stuff that many people have done, the psychoanalysis, you know. There are people who are highly virtuous who do not seek out power. Most people who are highly virtuous do not seek out power because they don't have that as a fundamental need for self-validation. And they may see power as corrupting. And so how do we create conditions in which the people who are the most virtuous are the ones who get elevated to positions of power, either in elective office, or certainly our domain is more in the business world? How do we, as boards of directors and others who are responsible, who are charged with finding those leaders, how do we apply the right lenses so that we look for emotional intelligence, we look for spiritual intelligence, we look for systems intelligence, right? Not just analytical intelligence. IQ is a given, okay? Everybody's smart. There's no shortage of smarts in the world. We're all becoming more, every generation is far more intelligent than the last, just purely in IQ terms. But those other things matter a lot more. So we can actually screen for that, right? We can identify who those leaders are. They may not be, knocking on the door to become a leader. They're not doing all the politicking behind the scenes. But if we have the wisdom to be able to find a Satya Nadella, if the conclave has the wisdom to find a Francis, right, in the church, then the impact of that is dramatic. So I think who gets to be a leader in our system is a big question, and how do we pick them and how do we develop them? Because everybody is a work in progress, right? But how do we pick people who have the fundamentals in place in terms of values, in terms of empathy, in terms of emotional intelligence? What the actual data show is that if you look in the organization at the level of just emotional intelligence, right, it is lowest at the level of CEO within companies. Okay, this was in the Harvard Business Review some years ago. CEOs have the lowest level of emotional intelligence, and it goes up as you go down in the organization, and it peaks around middle management. Okay, and another research has shown that the profession with the highest percentage of incidence of sociopaths is CEO. Okay. Second is surgeons. Now, why is that? Who becomes a CEO in our system? The people who are ruthless, who are completely motivated by self-interest and by numbers, delivering on their targets and therefore getting the bonuses and promotions and stock options, etc., without regard to the human cost of it. They're the ones who get selected or promoted constantly and rapidly, and then they rise to CEO. If you look at a Jack Welch, widely celebrated during his lifetime, but now in hindsight seen as a tremendously corrosive impact on what it means to be a leader. And look at what's happened at Boeing and other companies that are run by his proteges. Many, many companies have almost been destroyed by that mindset. And so I think who gets to be a leader? How do we select? How do we develop leaders within the organization is the critical question here. And there have to be people with empathy, with a conscience, with compassion, with wisdom, with strength, but fundamentally rooted in love. I have an acronym I use called SELFLESS to describe the qualities of conscious leaders. They're strong, they have energy and enthusiasm, they are rooted in love. Strength and love must go together. As Martin Luther King said, we must be tough-minded and tender-hearted at the same time, not one or the other. They have flexibility, they show up with the right approach in a given situation. They have emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and systems intelligence. We can find people that are like that. They're out there, but we have to find them, right, within the organization.
Thank you, Raj. It's been a joy to listen to you. My question is very simple, really leading on from what you've just said. What are our future leaders going to be like? My question is, I've just been to a conference which suggested that children up to 7 years old, 25% of them have an iPhone. So if you have children who are less than 7 years old, already realizing that they can get almost anything they need using a screen, which is personalized largely, what impact would this have on love and trust as an empathic leader? Because clearly it's difficult to perhaps, start looking at how to be more social on an iPhone, or will social interaction be very different when they become leaders? And we need to develop different skills in this digital world.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and we're of late awakening to that reality. I think Jonathan Haidt's book is actually creating a lot of policy changes. There are many places around the US, and I believe in the England as well, where they're banning phones from schools, and many parents are now becoming much more vigilant about this and not allowing this for their kids, and certainly certain apps and social media, etc. So hopefully we will correct and adjust as we go in time. I think the other dimension that we haven't touched upon here going forward is the whole masculine feminine side of this. As we know, the world has been dominated by men and by masculine energy, which is not the same thing, right? All humans, men and women, we all have masculine and feminine within us. Carl Jung said every man has an inner woman, every woman has an inner man. We've got that. We are all products of mothers and fathers. But the masculine has been elevated in society and feminine has been suppressed. And women have been sidelined. As I said, they couldn't vote until 100 years ago. It's still a tiny fraction of corporate leaders. It's getting better than it was 20 years ago, but it's still quite low. And I think the need for an integration of masculine and feminine energy is essential in leaders. We talked about strength and love, right? You can think of those as a masculine energy or a feminine energy. It's need both. It's not about saying we've had too much masculine for throughout history, and therefore now we need to move into a matriarchy. It's really about the wholeness. I think in the Indian tradition, we have a symbol for that, right? We have all these different gods, and each of them is meant to symbolize something. There's one called the Ardhanareshwar, half male, half female god. It's Shiva on one side and Parvati on the other, right? So one side is masculine, one side is. It's basically saying that we are born with genders for reproductive reasons, but our journey is towards wholeness, towards embodying the beauty of both of those aspects of a human, right? Love, empathy, compassion, nurturing, strength, courage, focus, resilience, etc. Again, none of those are the domains of any one gender. All of them are available to all of us. And so I think having that, become much more prominent in the world. We are starting to see more women obviously come into leadership in companies and in countries, but not nearly enough. In the past, of course, the only women who made it were iron ladies, right? You had Thatcher and you had Golda Meir and you had Indira Gandhi, right? The three leaders on the world stage. And two of them were called Iron Lady. And Indira Gandhi in India, when I was growing up, was referred to as the only man in her cabinet, even though she was the only woman in her cabinet, right? Because she was tougher and more ruthless and more aggressive than the men put together, because that's what you had to do in order to survive in that world. I think we're coming to an age and a stage where you can actually be whole and you can be loving and strong, and you can actually, as a woman, also show up in your natural way of being, right? As opposed to having to, in a way, take on overly masculine traits and so forth. I have a book on this called Shakti Leadership, where we explore all this in great detail, I think. But that's one of the big stories, I think, of this century. It will be, when all is said and done. But the 19th century was about the end of totalitarianism and the end of slavery. The 20th was largely about the end of totalitarianism, and the 21st will be about the end of the sidelining of the feminine and the elevation of wholeness, right? So that finally we can have men and women. It's like the two wings of a bird, right? The masculine wing and the feminine wing can finally both find full expression and elevate the bird of humanity even higher and go faster. So that's a dimension we haven't touched upon here.
It's interesting that the version of Shiva and Parvati that I've come across, although Shiva would be the masculine dimension, it also represents silence, and Parvati, the feminine dimension, more represents the dynamism of nature.
Yes.
Interesting.
That is Shakti. That's why we use the word Shakti. Shakti is that animating force. And the masculine is seen as the stillness, holding the space, and then the animation. So yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you. Yes, and a big thank you again. It's been fascinating listening to everything that's been said. I think my question is maybe just around sort of one example, perhaps, and one of the most disturbing examples of what we might call unconscious capitalism that came to mind. It might be BP's complete reversal on their non-fossil fuel business. So it's been blamed on an activist investor, shareholder, and the market's perhaps not allowing investment in future energy sources to be fundamentally profitable, which we spoke about near the beginning of the conversation. So really some thoughts on how do we address that in absence of suitable leaders? Perhaps we can find them, but does the system support them? So is it more a leadership issue or a systems issue? And what agency do we have? What can we do about it?
Yeah, I think to me it is a system issue. It's the financial system, the system of our publicly traded companies, the rise of activist investors in recent years, who, I don't know what the laws are there, but in the US, if an investor accumulates something like 9.5% of the outstanding shares, they then have the right to issue proxies that go out to all the shareholders, and they can advocate for certain changes in the company. And if they can get enough people behind that, then in a way force the hand of the leadership team. This is what happened at Whole Foods. That's why Whole Foods is now part of Amazon, because they got attacked by two different activist investors who basically came to John Mackey holding a gun to his head on a Wednesday and basically had a list of demands. And so you need to fire the majority of your board members by Monday. You need to announce a layoff of 20% of your workforce, 20,000 people. And you need to say that you're open to a merger with one of the big three grocery stores, Albertsons, Kroger, or Publix. And you need to do all this by Monday, or else. Okay. And he said, what do you mean, or else? He said, you'll see. I mean, it was that kind of almost a mafiosi kind of scene. Okay. And that afternoon, John gave an interview to the Texas Monthly Magazine, and in which he talked about this, and you can find it on the web. And he says, these guys are greedy bastards. He said the owner of the one of the activist investors, Jana Partners, he just bought the most expensive house in America, $170 million house in Long Island. He doesn't care about our company. He doesn't care about our employees. He doesn't care about our customers. He doesn't care about our purpose. All he wants to do is to flip the stock as soon as, if we do these things, and the stock price always goes up in the short term, and then he'll be gone, right? He's trying to kill my baby. Whole Foods is my baby, and he's trying to kill my baby. He has to kill me first, okay? These were fighting words. But the reality is that John was kind of backed into a corner there, because Whole Foods stock had fallen 40% in the last 2 years at that time, because of growing competition and price pressure from others who were starting to sell organic and natural foods as well. And they were in the process of trying to adjust their strategy and trying to, this happens, by the way, there's no great company in the world within a 10-year period where the stock doesn't go down 30, 40%. There's always fluctuations, and there's always need to adjust. And that had happened multiple times in their history. They were able to adapt. In 2008, their stock had fallen 90%, but everybody was falling, so this didn't happen. But anyway, so that's why he was forced to then fly to Seattle and get into the conversation about being acquired, because, literally the Whole Foods would have died. He did not have an adequate defense against that possibility. So I think our system that gives so much power not to investors, but to speculators. See, an investor is somebody, short-term investing is an oxymoron. Investing by definition is something that happens in the long term. You plant a tree and you don't say, tomorrow I need the fruits, right? Or you don't tug at it every day saying, grow faster. I mean, everything meaningful takes time. And so our system that allows short-term speculators the same amount of power as long-term investors is a problem. And there was a stock market that was being launched in the US a couple of years ago called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, LTSE. The premise of that was that the amount of voting power that you have depends on how long you hold your shares. If you buy them yesterday, you don't get that much voting power at all. But if you've been around for years, then you get more. So it increases over time because you're a true investor in that business, right? So that's one of and there are other factors as well. So I think changing the laws when companies go public, and what are the regulations and laws around that. So the benefit corporation idea, B Corps, for example, I think France has its own version of that now. A number of countries are creating their own versions of that. In the US, about 38 states have benefit corporations that have certain explicit provisions that are part of their charters, right, when they are incorporated. That gives a measure of protection against this kind of, and then, somehow diminishing the toxic impact of activist investors. There are times when activist investors are a force for good. There's one called engine number 2 or something. They basically go to companies like Exxon and try to get them to be more environmentally conscious and have board members who think about alternative energy. And you're talking about BP. But most activist investors are purely in it for the short-term return. And they're essentially destroying great companies. This is happening to Unilever right now, right? After Paul Polman. It's sad to see. This is what happens to many conscious companies. They come under attack, and many conscious companies get taken down by activist investors, and they just make them become, again, purely mercenary, focused purely on the bottom line. Southwest Airlines, another great conscious company that is now in the process of, has been attacked and have made a lot of changes to appease. Appeasement then becomes the response by the leaders because they get locked into that, dilemma, So I think there are some systemic issues there. It's becoming harder, and therefore many conscious companies are choosing not to go public at all. So why would we subject ourselves to that kind of abuse and pressure and existential threat? And there are many public companies that are, in fact, going private. They don't want to be dealing with this anymore. And that's a problem at a societal level because we need healthy and thriving public markets where we can invest our retirements and all pensions and all those things, right? But the number of public companies in the US has shrunk by more than half compared to what it used to be, I think, in the last 2 decades or so. Okay, and there are fewer IPOs now. And so I think there's a real problem. If you want thriving public market, we have to allow companies to have their purpose and values and be able to enact and live those without this kind of vultures constantly circling them,
Couple of messages for members. Forthcoming gatherings include Your Marketing Kind with Anna Turns on the role of journalism in tackling climate change on May 22nd. Then our exchange with Tim Jackson. People know him. He did an exchange with us before. He was the Sustainable Development Commissioner for the UK and is a post-growth economist who wrote Prosperity Without Growth. And we'll be talking to him about the care economy on June 17th. And Raj, I often feel close to our guests because I spend a lot of time investigating their ideas, listening to them speak, reading their books before we talk to them. And in your case, that's sort of doubly, well, maybe triply so, partly because your most recent book, Awaken, has so much, I think it's your most recent book, it's the most recent one I've read, has so much memoir content. So much of it is an autobiography, a very courageous autobiography that I highly recommend, and that definitely makes business personal by translating it into your own story. And you have really sort of forged a path for us who have a background in marketing to move beyond the way we currently have operated. And so I really want to thank you for everything you've done before today, as well as today. And I hope that today won't be our last conversation with you because it has truly inspired us all.
Sure. Well, I just put a link to that book, Awaken, the website. It's the first time I've written about my own life in any of my books. And it's turned into quite a reflective exercise in looking back and making sense and trying to extract some lessons from that. And there are reflections at the end of every chapter so people can actually apply some of those things to their own life, But thank you, Paul. I do a lot of these kinds of things, and very few of them are as thoughtfully curated and with as much preparation and depth of insight that you bring to it. So I really enjoyed our time together, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much.
I'll probably participate in some of your upcoming things.
We would love that.
As an audience member.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.